This is Sg2 Perspectives, a weekly conversation between the Sg2 intelligence team and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare. We're happy you joined us today. Enjoy the episode.
We need messengers for just the practicality of when you're trying to get a message out to the organization. You can't do all of these conversations on your own. There are going to be some that you need to have a one-on-one personalized conversation, typically anchored by their role within the strategy and probably their influence within it. But we also need messengers to be able to scale those communication to make sure that message is consistently deployed across the organization.
Welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host for today's episode, Jayme Zage. We've talked a lot about implementing your strategic plan. Putting your strategic plan into action and getting the desired results that you are looking for is really hard work. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Rebecca Limestall and Janelle Kwan, to talk about how to use communication as a catalyst to kickstart sustainable momentum on the actions needed to implement your plan. Welcome, Janelle and Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Jayme.
Let's start by setting a foundation here. We all know strategic planning always fails at the implementation stage when it fails, so we don't need to go over that. But why is communication such an important part of a successful implementation component?
Part of it is that the success of a strategy relies on stakeholders across the organization. But all of those different stakeholders have played a different part in crafting that strategy. Communication is a way for providing clarity for the people within our organization who are not necessarily part of those conversations, but play a role in executing and enabling that strategy. We see communication as a way to provide clarity around what are we working towards, how will we do it, and ultimately, how do I as an individual and my broader team, what role do we play in enabling us to achieve that larger vision?
When we talk to strategy leaders, most of us feel like we're great at communication. Our job is to facilitate great ideas, to bring people together, to get buy-in, to assess what's going on in the market and help other people understand. Sometimes we fail at the diligence that is needed to cascade the communication of strategy to execution throughout the organization. We need to be putting the same amount of effort and perhaps even more into regimenting and systematizing the strategic execution communication. Otherwise, we're going to have some great ideas that just never happen.
Rebecca and I love to use the metaphor of the game of telephone. You tell one person, they tell another, and by the end, you are so far removed from the initial message you tried to communicate. Communication mixes the personal, individual needs and priorities and context with scale and consistency. And so a tight approach to strategic communication marries those two worlds.
I'll also add that change management is something you've heard before. Strategy and strategic plans should be part of the change management of the organization. Change management structure in reality is that we need to communicate effectively, frequently, getting this information out there consistently in order to make sure people have heard us and are driving towards the same goals that we are.
You've talked a lot about what's important, consistency, clarity, making sure it's personal so they understand their role in it. How does the message need to change for different stakeholders?
When we look at the different stakeholders, we do believe that a stakeholder assessment is an important element of strategic communication planning. Understanding what we need from those stakeholders, this is our audience. What do we need them to do? How do we want them to feel? And how is it that we're going to get communication back from them if things are working or not working? We need to understand who is a decision maker and who is someone who just needs to know. Those are the most important aspects of a stakeholder assessment. Sometimes folks will want to do it based on titles, based upon roles. We find it's critical to think more about how the decisions are being made, who gets a vote and who gets a veto.
If we kind of simplify that, you have people in the organization who do the work. They actually execute it. You have people you need buy-in from. They could nix an idea. And you also have individuals who bear some level of responsibility for results, what they need to hear, their role within that. And then you also have people, we need to keep them educated and informed. They need to just know that it's happening. And these are largely audiences that often face us externally. The idea, and I think one point we want to reiterate, is often our default is we look at seniority and title as a way to guide what information should be shared. And here it's about relevance to the work and the end outcomes.
That's a good insight there. It's really about the who and their involvement. So then does that message need to change over time? Janelle, at your intro, you talked about the start of the process. How does that communication change when we're now at a critical milestone or further along in the implementation?
When we talk through organizations around beyond a stakeholder assessment, the actual communication plan, we talk about the need to build in those intervals of communication. And sometimes it's to provide an update on a particular milestone. This was an initial goal that we accomplished, and we want to be able to celebrate that and tell you where we're going next. There are other times where we find that maybe we need to pivot, or the initial strategy that we are executing, there is an off-ramp. We need to be able to also communicate that a change is in fact happening in our direction and the rationale why. Particularly as we think about, they're all invested on this process with you. And if you don't also give them some of those indicators of where they're going, you are at incredible risk of losing their engagement and their support. Rebecca talked earlier about the role of change management. Nowhere is it more important than when we're trying to communicate that we need to do something differently. And we need to be able to articulate why.
This is often where we see the execution role in strategy teams being so different than what it used to be. There's a lot more onus of the execution and accountability of a strategic plan sitting within the purview of the strategy team now. And because of that, we've got to have that process in place of who we're going to talk to, what are we going to tell, how are we going to message it, what information do we expect back from those individuals? Are there things that we want to iterate on? Janelle raises a good point. If we are going to pivot on something, how do we communicate that, inform your culture as well? Are you more of a learning organization? Are you a nimble organization? Do you take risks? Can people make decisions quickly and effectively? Or are you more of a focused organization in your execution where you're saying yes to this and no to these things because they're not what we're interested in right now? They're good, but they're not exactly where we're going. Those types of execution cultures are important to know as you're shaping the communication pathway. If you are more of that nimble organization, talking about pivots, talking about, hey, we learned this, we're moving to this, here's the natural flow, that's great. And people understand that's part of how we do business here. It's okay to have a failed project. We learned. If you're that organization that is more focused on that long-term goal and is very good about saying yes and no, it's not as dire if a business plan gets rejected because it's not in line with the vision. So those are some of the things to pay attention to when you think about the match of your culture in terms of execution with your communication style and what's most important to those different stakeholders.
What I'm hearing is there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of different reasons why you need to communicate, why you might need to communicate differently, changes you might need to communicate, the timing, who, the stakeholder, all of those things. Is there a framework to guide how you would effectively communicate given all of the different things and considerations around the communication? How could you be more effective every time you communicate?
We do have a method that we recommend for communication, and we use the acronym of SCRIPT. If you know Janelle or I, you know that we don't do scripts very well. We love to talk and engage an audience, and there's a lot of pivots on the way. This idea of having a script for communication is a little tongue-in-cheek there. But let's talk about the actual letters and what matter. S is for simple, being able to get it down to a simple message. We work with one organization who has gotten their strategic goal down to just 6 words, their mission, vision, and values into something that can be held on an index card. That's something that they can cascade and people are more likely to remember. Communication also needs to be consistent. That's our C. It is perpetual and continuing to hammer in that same message. This is where we're going. This is how we learn. This is what we're doing along the way. As we think about that consistency, there's a quote from, I believe it was a former CEO of LinkedIn that said, essentially, until you're tired of saying it, no one has heard it. And I like to keep that in the back of our mind because we always think we've said this a ton of times. Haven't they heard it? Well, this is number 1,000 of things they need to do that day. We've got operators, we've got people who are working front lines, and this is not their top priority. So we need to make sure we're communicating consistently so they hear us. R is for results oriented. We can't just pontificate or give some FYIs. This is where we're going. This is our goal. This is what we're trying to reach as a team. I is for intentional. Having that consistency and the simple message does require intentionality. We work with one organization where even though he says it probably sounds repetitive, the CEO starts meetings with the same concept of, remember, we are here to do this, and making sure that we have that understanding for intentionality and where you're going to be introducing this message. It's not an FYI at the end of an email. Here's how you work in this system. Continuing with the script analogy here, or the acronym here, is personal. I read a lot of change management books, a little bit of a nerd in that space. One thing they all have in common is they will tell you that change doesn't mean something to the person until they know what it means for them. We've all been in those meetings where new boxes of an org chart are revealed or new goals or messages are released, and we're all looking for ourselves. That's the first natural reaction for people. We have to make sure it makes sense to them and be able to put them at what does it mean to you for us to be executors of this strategy. And then finally, the T in the script is two-way communication. A communication cascade is a bit of a misnomer. It actually goes both ways. We do a lot of two-way communication, particularly with the doers, those that are executing, those that are working towards the plan of what's working, what's not. How should we pivot? Is there a different way to do this? We may have addressed the why and the what, but we need the operators to help us with the how or question the why and the what. So those are some of the ways that we think about this idea of script, of being an area of evaluating your communication to see if your plan holds up to be effective.
This is where there's an opportunity for health systems to be able to learn. We are seeing some of the examples that Rebecca spoke to in other industries. I'm going to reference an example from the 80s, but you're going to bear with me on this. In the 80s, Scandinavian Airlines was in a bit of an existential crisis around its survival, and they felt there was a strategic vision that they needed for their survival, but they needed to get all of their employees on board. So they ended up creating a comic book with this underlying metaphor, we're going to fight this together. With a lot of visuals and sparse words, they used a narrative framework to tell the story of where the airline needed to go and everyone's individual role in being able to help them advance towards that goal. Now, you may decide today, comic book's not for us, but we use it to illustrate some of these key principles about being clear with where we need to go, identifying individual roles and advancing that goal, and being consistent in what that message was, with the goal that everyone within that organization, if you ask them, what are we trying to do? They knew how to answer that question and what their role meant within that.
Janelle, you offer something important here. What we're talking about is effective communication across the entire strategy journey. We do a lot of work with organizations on data storytelling, and that's one of the tools we arm them with. Narrative framework to get us towards decision making, clearing up the extra, making sure we are sticking to the point, understanding our audience. When we think about data storytelling, it's often in getting those decisions made, but it continues through this process of execution where the fundamentals of sticking with your audience, telling the narrative, keeping it consistent, all continue through that pathway of execution.
The other side of this is the person delivering the message. And in a recent report that you guys completed is this concept of different messengers. Can you describe what that is and why we might need different kinds of messengers for different situations?
So we need messengers for just the practicality of when you're trying to get a message out to the organization. You can't do all of these conversations on your own. There are going to be some that you need to have a one-on-one personalized conversation, typically anchored by their role within the strategy and probably their influence within it. But we also need messengers to be able to scale those communication, to make sure that message is consistently deployed across the organization. Messengers are important for practical matters, but they're really important also for articulating the message effectively and passionately. Messengers can be helpful when the person receiving that information, they're more likely to trust that messenger. They have context and understanding, and so that communication bridge allows that message to resonate differently. Messengers, though, as you point out, Jayme, all have different roles in communication. There are some that we will rely on for buy-in. We need them to function as a champion and to get others on board. So they can be a vehicle for being able to share what is the vision and encouraging others who maybe have some doubts or questions to get on board as well. We also have messengers who speak to an entirely external audience, and they are charged with being able to share the message with those external parties. So we need to arm them with what are we doing and why, and be able to speak to that broader audience. Rec, I'm certainly missing a few of these different messengers. Who are some of the others that we considered in that work as critical to strategic communication?
I want to also bring back something you said earlier and remind the listeners that we group our stakeholders into 4 categories: the doers, the buy-in support people, the accountability partner, and then those that need to be informed or educated. Where we use our messengers most is going to be getting those that are peripherally related to the project on board with either some buy-in, but more likely they're involved in the education and getting the informers and the educators on board. So what we often do is think about our potential messengers in terms of whether it's important for them to be involved. Perhaps they're an accountability partner. Perhaps they're one of the doers. Perhaps there's somebody that we depend on for their buy-in. They could veto it if they weren't excited about this. And then how much they are interested in. And for those folks who are important to the process and interested and excited about it, oh my goodness, give them a megaphone. Let them shout it from the rooftops. Give them the ability to communicate it because they're critical to the plan and they really care. For folks that are less interested but still important, we'll want to selectively partner with them, find specific ways to ask them to be engaged, to communicate and cascade this message, perhaps receive the feedback in certain ways. And those that are less core to the execution itself, they vary on the basis of how interested they are. You can still use an individual who is interested but not as much involved to make sure they're speaking about the strategy in rooms you're not in, making sure they have a consistent message. And for those that are not interested and not critical to the equation, let's just keep them informed.
Strategy also plays just a critical role in all this and in strategic communication more broadly. It is strategy's job to help distill that larger message, but equally important to arm and position our messengers to be able to share the message as well. So that's about relationship building. It's about training and making sure it ties it in together. You don't end up with that game of telephone.
Thank you, Janelle. That's a great way to wrap our conversation here. I like the idea that this communication plan is something that needs to come out of strategic planning so that everything is clear, but has to include some of those key stakeholders up front, just like you do in developing your strategic plan. But it's something they've got to maintain moving forward, especially if there are shifts and changes into that plan. For our audience, this is critical for them to understand their role in communicating the day-to-day operations that lead to the strategic planning initiative and the success of that implementation. So thank you both for sharing some of these details. For our SG2 members, you can look for the report on effective communications. It's a plan to action, the communication as a catalyst. For our listeners in general, thank you again for joining us today. We will see you next time on SG2 Perspectives.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sg2 Perspectives. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Sg2 if you have questions or suggestions for future episodes.